Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I am Eugene S. Robinson.
And today we are at episode 57, and we are calling this one the True or False Show.
That's great. That's a great one. You're going to lose.
Well, what we wanted to talk about is there are so many kind of pieces of advice or beliefs or narratives around work and career. And so many of them are not helpful that we really wanted to take a look at, like, what are some of these pieces of advice? And we will discuss whether we think they're true or false and kind of like under what circumstances. And we got a lot of great feedback we put this out on social media. A lot of you commented, which is great. We'd love to hear additional comments, Substack and YouTube, both places. We'd love to hear what you have to say. But I want to start with a story. So the first thing that I ever learned about work, I learned from my father. So my dad had a successful career. I really looked up to him. And when I was a little kid, we were watching the news. And this was when you watch the news on a TV at a certain time. And there had been some news incident happened in a small, obscure country that I had never heard of. And the news anchor was interviewing a professor who was an expert on the small country that I'd never heard of. Right. And my dad turned to me and he said, "That's job security. That guy knows more about that small piece of the world than anyone else." And he said, "Find something to do that you can do better than anyone else, and you will always have a job." And I was like, okay. I mean, seriously, I was like 8 or 9 years old. And I filed that away and I was like, that is so true. I'm going to be like my father. And I ended up going into business development, which is, sales for advertising agencies, which is very niche. Very few people do it well. And it's a very demanding job. And I was like, this is great. I'm set. Except it didn't work out for me. And it wasn't until years later that a friend of mine pointed out, when I was telling her this, I was actually doing a one-woman show and I was going to tell this story, right? Because it was so formative in my understanding of career. And she stopped me and she said, "Well, that didn't really work out for you, did it?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, that worked for your father because he was a man. Right. It didn't work for you because you're a woman." Right. And it was so interesting to me because it really was one of those, scales fall from my eyes moment. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was drawn to this topic, because I believed that story. Even when it didn't work for me, I kept thinking that's going to be what's going to keep me in a job and keep my career on track. And I was in my 50s when I figured out that was never going to happen for me. So that's one of the things we want to be mindful of, is that we hear these things and their truth or falseness is also part of a systemic thing, right? Like if I had been my father's son, that probably would have been great advice, but I was his daughter. And so it wasn't. So let's go ahead and start with one that the first belief. So here it is. No one ever looked back on their deathbed and wished they had spent more time at the office. True or false?
Yeah, I would say true. I mean, just, out of all the things that might be going, and, it depends on your sickness and how long you've been laid up. But I know a guy, and somebody was just talking to me about this guy, 69 years old, still working at a big company that we've all heard of, still working. The guy's got like an Aston Martin in his driveway. And finally, one of his coworkers, a guy telling me this story, said, "Why are you still here? Like, you don't need to even be here. You know." And the guy goes, "Honest truth, you want to?" He goes, "Yeah. Why?" He goes, "I can't stand being at home with my wife." So this guy, rather than getting a marriage counselor or rediscovering late life joy with his wife, he's choosing to go to work. But I'm even venturing this guy on his deathbed will not say, "Yeah, I really wish I spent even more time at work." I don't see that happening. They're just other things to do, which make themselves available to you as you get older. Man, I'd like to go mountain climbing or hang gliding or parasailing. It doesn't involve sitting at a desk, either being screamed at or screaming at people, which I know there's more to work than that. But realistically speaking, that's how I'm thinking about it. So,
I think it's true also, although I do want to acknowledge that I didn't work 3 jobs 7 days a week as a single mom of 2 little kids because I had an option, right? Some of us do what needs to be done to discharge our financial responsibilities. And it's a real privilege for people to have an option to decide how much time they want to spend at work. But
even those people, I think, when they get to that final stage set, are not going to be like, I wish I had done. I mean, the time that you spend with the people that you love is super valuable.
Absolutely. And and you can't go back for that, right? You can't make up the time later. Although I think there's one caveat is that people who find a lot of meaning in their work continue to want to explore that meaning. And I think they should be able to do it. I mean, our perspectives on work and our kind of, experience in the corporate world was largely not positive. But like, I know my aunt, who is right this minute walking across Portugal, is pretty sure she's going to retire when she gets back from her trip. She is 80. Right. But she works part-time as an attorney doing work that's deeply meaningful to her that helps the world. Right. So I think we want to acknowledge that, there are people for whom, like the office is their place of making a difference in the world.
I'd also like to talk to those people's loved ones to see if they would concur, because as a child of an academic, I've seen people who are really, connected to people who are really super in love with what they did, but they were crappy parents. So
true. Yeah, exactly. All right. So the next one, this actually this was sent in by someone, and I'll tell you what his opinion was. Don't show vulnerability at work. It'll be seen as a weakness.
Oh, no, that's false.
Okay. Tell me why.
Well, there are a couple of things. I remember when I was at Ozzy, fronted by the convicted felon, Carlos Watson, he at one point said, listen, if ever you feel close to being burned out, come to me before and let me know. We don't want any accidents here. We don't want any. And I was like, okay, great. So I'd worked, I think, 2 24-hour days, which means all around the clock, not in segments. And I was turning out 14 articles a week. It's a heavy load. And I was feeling, I was going through a divorce at the time, and all I needed was a Saturday. We had a 7-day work week initially. I just needed a Saturday to get some stuff done, something with the kids. And I went to him. I said, hey, man, you said, come to you if you feel burned out. I'm pretty close to being that now. I probably need and he's like, yeah, great. Okay, well, you know what? Finish that up, and I'll see you here tomorrow. And it was like I said nothing or said something in another language. Was I punished for it? No, not necessarily. Was I heated? Not necessarily. So, and I've been in situations where, I've seen grown adult men cry, executives cry. I mean, of course, we were being laid off, so that made sense, but I don't think it exerted a deleterious effect on their careers. But I think probably it's because it plays against type. I imagine I could get emotional or vulnerable in a work setting and people would find it endearing. I think if you are in the same work setting and you're getting emotional, they're just going to go, that's a women thing, Right. So, and that's not what you want. So,
well, and the Robin who sent this in, on LinkedIn, who appears from his profile picture to be a white man, he said that he thinks it's false and that he found that once he realized that this was bad advice and started being more vulnerable, he saw a lot of benefits in his career. I actually think that it is true. With some caveats. And I think there's a lot of talk about show up as your authentic self at work. And that is not, And I think the idea of like showing vulnerability before you decide whether or not that's what you want to do, you need to assess the psychological safety of your workplace. Right. Because there are workplaces, and I have been in them, as have you, that are not places of psychological safety, and you need to protect yourself. So I think it's not a question of, whether you'll be perceived as weak or not. It's a question of whether you will be safe or not and what level of vulnerability it is safe for you to express. So I say that is actually true with a caveat. So that's one where we disagree. Right, okay. The next one is something that is kind of common advice that is given, that are things like something for a boss to say. And it's this phrase: don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. Do you think that is good advice or bad advice?
I think it's good advice. I've said it before in my time as a boss. I mean, my attitude is like, what I'm asking you to do is to do a little bit of the footwork for me. So, I'm downstairs at Max Roach's lobby. He wouldn't let me come up to conclude the interview. What should I do? Okay, I'm willing to help. I'll call Max Roach, maybe see if I can get you up there. Max Roach curses me out. The guy doesn't get up. I don't get the piece. I didn't hold that against the guy. I thought that's exactly what you use the editor-in-chief for. Or Alicia Keys wants to be on the cover of the magazine with her husband. And I said, no, this is about you as a producer and engineer. It's just you. She doesn't want to go through with it. Creative director calls me and I make a judgment call. Okay, I understand that. But there are other things like, well, I have a piece due in 2 weeks and I really don't know where to go with it. I just, it's your job to figure this out. I mean, think about it. Come to me with, I can help you decide it's this, or this, but coming to me with nothing that's not useful and helpful. And if I'm a boss in that situation, I actually do hold it against you. So.
And this is another one where we disagree, because I agree with Rob, who sent this in, who says, this belief, quote, just allows bad practices and a toxic workplace to continue unabated. And I do think that he makes a really valid point, right? Which is, again, if we're looking at a workplace as a system, part of a larger cultural system, if I have come to leaders and said, there's a hostile work environment here. Women are treated differently than men. There's, these things are happening. The solution is, the solution is something that the leader should be willing to take and own. Right.
Okay. A process problem is maybe different from a work-related problem, right? If somebody comes to me and says, as has happened, this person, when you're not in this office, this person is terrorizing the whole office. They're throwing shit against the wall. They're screaming. And of course, one day I happened to come back early from a meeting and the person was doing exactly that. That I understood as, I'm not passing a buck on that. It's my job to deal with that. So I'm just talking about like work stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you are someone who is reporting to a boss, which most of us are, you try to come with solutions. Right? Like try to come with solutions, let your boss, right? But I do think if you are a leader, to maybe just have that moment in your mind, like, is this a systemic issue? Is this a process issue? Am I passing the buck? Because I think people have used this phrase so many times as leaders that sometimes they neglect to stop and be like, actually, this is my problem to solve. This is not their problem to solve. Okay. So Laura, who is in executive leadership, said she was told, know your limitations by a leader. True or false?
No. I think that's colossally bad advice. I say false. What do you mean, know your limit? What is that supposed to be? Know your limitations. I mean, I know it's from the movie Magnum Force, the second Dirty Harry movie in the series, where he tells Hal Linden, I believe, what does he say? He goes, a good man knows his limitations. Right. But I know your limitations. I know. No, false.
Okay. Laura also agreed that it was false. And she noticed that she has never heard that she believes that comment to her was gendered. And someone else chimed in the comments, a man who said, yeah, I've heard that. And it's never been told to me, a man. It's only been told to women. So this is one where I think you need to be mindful of the context and that this can be used as a weapon. However, I actually think that this is true. As a piece of advice, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, understanding your limitations realistically so that you can mitigate them. So for example, if I have a limitation where I suck at detail work and I'm in a leadership position, I need to have someone on my team who can do the detail work because I have a limitation. right? And
in a macro sense, correct.
Yeah. So I do think that any kind of self-awareness is going to be useful to you as a leader and as a person. And a lot of times it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People who have low skill sometimes have high confidence and vice versa. And so someone who thinks I should be on tour because I have an amazing voice and can't sing, carry a tune in a bucket, as they say, is going to be bitterly disappointed when they try to make a living as a singer. Right. And so it is useful to understand, but I think the larger point is, since this is so often weaponized against women and, marginalized groups, you don't need to say know your limitations to someone who you're really trying to limit.
Right. As a life rule, it's probably good. I mean, look, my whole professional career, the majority of my professional career has been in editorial. And as such, I've done every job. I've done assistant editor, associate editor. I've done technical editor. I've done, copy editor. I've done it all, editor at large, editor in chief, but managing editor is the hill that I died on, right? Because there are two types of managing editors. There's a managing editor that's like an editorial director, which I thought I was getting. And then there's the managing editor that's like the traffic cop who's really good at Excel spreadsheets. And, this little detail tells you where there's a terrible at it. And it helped me when I finally figured that out on the job. The boss came in and said, hey, what do we have coming up in March? And I pull up a little scribble notepad that I have. I said, and I just read the stuff off the notepad. I go, that's what we have coming up in March. He goes, well, why isn't it in the the Slack channel on the Excel spreadsheet? And it was at that point that I figured out I need to leave here. I need to get out. I'm not that functionary. I got sorry, I gotta go. So,
right. And so in that case, knowing your limitations would have helped you be, a little bit better prepared for that. All right. Yes, so this one also sent in by Robin. He says, before I speak, I always ask myself 3 questions. Does this need to be said? Does this need to be said by me? Does this need to be said by me right now? If the answer to any of these questions is no, I just leave it. And he's talking about in a work context at a meeting.
Yep. True
or false?
I'm going to say true, though I violated that at every single job I've ever had. I'm a talker and don't do such a good job of stopping myself from talking, even if it helps me, but whatever.
I agree that it is true. And there's another simpler formula, and these are attributed to multiple people, so I'm not sure the genesis of this, but there's another formula, which is this true, necessary, and kind? Right. But I think that overall, whatever your framework or whatever your process, to pause, especially if you are agitated or angry, before you speak. And whatever goes on in your head, I think the pause is the key, whether you're counting to 20 or going through some sort of a, device in your head. I do think it's really important, right? Because just taking a beat before you send an email, a Slack message, a text, say something can really save you a lot of trouble in the long run, especially if you're feeling kind of hijacked by emotions.
Right. And then I would also bifurcate with especially if you're sending an email. In the meeting, during the course of a give and take, you might say some stuff that's out of pocket, but people maybe don't remember that, but they'll remember an email, so yeah.
Right.
Different levels of caution.
And I think it's also useful. I mean, different executives that I've coached have different ways of approaching this, but it's always useful for the boss to be very intentional about when and how they speak, right? Yeah. So I've known executives who don't talk about an issue until everybody else has spoken, right? Which I think is very skillful, because people are going to give extra weight to the most senior person in the room, especially if that person has a lot of power. And so holding back and waiting, and so I do think that being intentional about how and when you speak is good for all of us, but especially for the boss.
Yeah, I remember when I took over this woman from Condé Nast that started Code Magazine, a men's fashion magazine, and she left part of the way through, and then I took over the job. And she had come from Condé Nast, and I think she had done fashion magazines. And so the tone and the timbre of the workplace culture was very much fashion dictated. There were people stalking out, getting offended, stalking out of meetings, sucking their teeth, rolling their eyes, all of this kind of performative fashion industry, catty comments. And when she left, the first meeting that we had after she left, I said, like everybody sit down, and I identified all of those, stalking out of a meeting, interrupting, being, in general, unkind, not helpful. I go, that will now get you fired. It's not a healthy way to proceed in life or your professional life, and it's not going to get us what we need to get done quickly and helpfully. So if you're not down with that now, God love you. If there are other places you can go to work, give me notice and you can hang out for 2 weeks and do something else. But I can't have that here. No slamming doors, no screaming, none of that. And they listened. And the one negative comment, it came from somebody else. So Tim, who is my stylist, my style editor, stylist, he said, I believe Eugene is homophobic. I said, I did not, gender. I did not ascribe any sexual identity to these issues. I just called them out as I had seen them over the past 2 months as being things that drove me crazy, that I didn't like and that needed to stop. And it wasn't going to help us do something great and creative. And I talked to Tim about it later. I said, I don't know where you're getting the homophobic thing from. I'm absolutely not that. But, I'm trying to get a streamlined workplace, and I need you to help me with it. And part of that is, if you need something, you can say difficult things during the course of this meeting, but leaving means the conversation's over, so we've not concluded. It's like taking a crap in the middle of the room and leaving it there. Do not do this to me. And he said, okay, I got it. And, I thought we had come to an accord. Of course, years later, I read something he put on Instagram that indicated he had not adjusted to the change, but we did win a bunch of awards after that. So I think the proof of the pudding was in the tasting. So,
but what you're doing, and this isn't on my list of true or false advice, but advice that I often give to groups and teams is start with group agreements. Articulate specifically how you hold meetings, what your cultural values are. And that's exactly what you did. You're like, this is how we interact with one another in a team. This is what's acceptable. This is what's not acceptable. These are what the consequences are. And I do that with every time I do a facilitation, every time I start with a new team or a training, I will just take a beat in the beginning and let's articulate what this looks like. It's such an easy thing to do that a lot of people just don't do. So there's advice to do that.
You can get lost in. I understand getting swept away with it. I remember once I was in Rome, in Rome, and a car and a scooter had gotten into an accident. Now, we've seen this in America. Would it be somebody taking notes and looking kind of aggrieved, and somebody on the phone? These two men was this wonderful, they were both in their separate little kiosks, pulling their hair, tearing their shirt open, looking at God. How could this happen to me? And they were both next to each other. But and I go, this is probably the most Italian thing I've ever seen. They weren't angry with each other. They were just having this kind of moment with God. How could you do this to me? So yeah, I did it. It helps to agree.
It helps to agree. That is absolutely true. Okay, so here is one that is used often in talking about negotiating for a salary or a raise, particularly directed at women. Right. Ask for the highest amount you can say without bursting out laughing. True or false?
Oh, I think that's true. In fact, but I would add a proviso. I was like, the first person to mention money usually loses. So do not mention any dollar figure. Just say, I've bent over backwards not answering that question, because the first time I was greatly surprised, I realized I should shut my mouth and not. I think it was maybe Apple. When I went to Apple, and they were like, well, what are your salary requirements? And what I was going to say was $40,000 off of what they told me. And I realized now, keep your mouth shut. Let them tell you. You don't tell them. So
So I disagree with you on both counts. I think this
Okay.
is a terrible piece of advice. It is a piece of advice that is given frequently by a woman named Cindy Gallup, who I love, love, love,
Uh,
love. And it's a great soundbite. But
uh,
actually, when I do a negotiation training, which I do, and I do a lot of it specifically for women, what I say to them is you need to do your research.
mhm.
You need to find out what you should be getting paid or what the salary range is for this position. And I go through like you forget this, like you can't ask people at work what they make. Ask other people what they make. Be connected. It's a whole process. So they need to, before you negotiate anything, you need to do your homework. So you have actual facts about what a reasonable salary is. Once you know that, you should then add on a premium to that, right? But you need to come in with a number that is real. The idea of like just ask for something super high, which is essentially what this says. And I know that that's not the point that she is making. The point is ask for the money. The second thing I would say is you do need to mention the money, because if you understand what it is that you are going to ask for, you need to say it. Because one of the things that I've seen, particularly working for myself, right? People will often outline, and this happened to me when I worked in the agency world too. They would outline a project of significant scope and duration that I knew full well would cost $250,000. And I would say, what's your budget? And they would say, well, you tell me how much it's going to cost. And I would say, it's going to cost $250,000. They're like, well, no, I only have 20. In which case we're done talking. Oh, I can't. That's happened multiple times. And so, if I am going for a new job and I know that I should be getting paid X, I want to get X into the conversation just to save everybody's time.
Like, it's interesting you say that, because later on in my career, so I'm talking about like from maybe 2005 on, I realized I needed to do that, because if I'm going to go through a number of different interviews and just kind of, brush off the shoulder this idea of, well, I work for personal satisfaction, I work for money. So what, if it's market consistent, I'm fine, those, and then, so now you're 9 interviews in, they're about to make an offer, and then they hit you with the salary that's woefully under what you would take. Now you look like an ass. So yeah, at some point, once you get in there, whatever the market standard is, let me tell, is there a range? Maybe you could ask that as a question. And of course, through Glassdoor and through LinkedIn, it's easy now to find out what that position kind of sort of should pay. So you have a range in your head. Then it makes sense, because who wants to waste anybody's time? You're certainly not going to not hurt somebody's feelings, take a job where you're woefully underpaid because you think it'll be good for you. No. Right. So yeah, to a certain degree, yeah, correct.
Yeah. So that's one that gets me. And by the way, the training that I do for negotiations for women is available on YouTube. So you can search me, find me, or you can, send us an email at WTF@badbossbrief.com, and I will send it to you. It is free and you can take a look at it. Okay. Here's one we've talked about before. You have to stay at a job for 2 years or it will look bad on your resume.
False. I say that's false. I mean, there have been weird times in Silicon Valley where if you stayed at a job for more than 3 years and there was not a significant apparent reason why, people would look at you, and this is during the go-go days in Silicon Valley, people would be like, what's the matter with you? Of course, when the first major recession hit and then, they're looking at your resume and you've been at every job for about 2 or 3 years, they're like, am I going to invest in this guy? This guy's a job hunter, a job hopper. So it changes depending on the greater economic environment. But yeah, I'm not. Yeah,
I agree. I think that's totally false. I do think that if you are going to be moving jobs after less than 6 months, you better have a very compelling reason in your cover letter. But I think that's old school. It's not really germane.
And it also depends on the industry too. I mean, I've spent a lot of time at magazines. A lot of magazines fold. This is, so.
And people get laid off. All right. So one last quick one. Dress for the job you want, or some variation about dressing professionally to succeed. True or false?
I've always hated that. I've always hated that. However, as an African-American man, I've had to do it, right? I've had to do it because I don't want because I just had to, I had to remove that as a possible topic of conversation in the offices of people who might give me a raise. So, but I was dragged kicking and screaming to doing this. You remember at Ozzy, I was like, great, workplace casual. And, the chairwoman of the board said, hey, come on, we're going out. And she took me out to Nordstrom's and said, somebody in that office has to look like an adult, and it's you. I'm picking you, and bought me like 3 suits, 3 shirts, a belt, ties, and said, wear these until I fall off. And so that was, I mean, in other words, I believe it to be important. I believe other people believe it's important. And it's more important than I personally believe it is, but I've had to do the okey doke and do it during the course of my career. So.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's a good guideline to keep in mind. However, I also think you need to be mindful of the expense. And I don't think that it makes up for it, right? I mean, I think that you can dress successfully and still run into sexism and racism and ageism. I mean, it's not a magic, you're not going to magically manifest a job and a raise if there are systemic things working against you just because you wear a nice suit.
Also, I remember being in some meeting, and I think this was at Apple. And at one point, I'm dressed nicely, right? And I got friendly with this outside vendor that we were meeting with. And, I think my Apple person had left the room. So it was just me and this vendor. And the guy says, hey, no, I'm sorry. It was a woman. And she said, can I ask you a question? And I go, yeah, sure. Go ahead. And she goes, are you gay? I'm like, no, I'm not. But she goes, oh, I'm sorry. You were so well dressed, and the other vendor has the hots for you. I go, okay, all right, maybe we could focus on the job here. Yeah, I am well dressed, thank you. But let's just focus here on not dating, but the job, the project here.
It's so inappropriate in so many ways. We will always have content for this show.
That's right. Well, Apple was the first place where I saw workplace casual kick in, and I rebelled against it. When I'm sitting in the cafeteria and the guy's walking through with no shoes, no socks, no pants, and no t-shirt, just shorts. I'm like, you know what? No. I would never do this. First of all, one, because I don't believe I could and get away with it. And eventually they got that guy and they said, look, you can't do. So he begrudgingly put on a t-shirt, but still no shoes, no socks, shorts, and a t-shirt now.
Yeah. So I think the idea is be mindful of workplace norms around dress, particularly, again, if you are a person of color, if you are, younger and need to battle any kind of, misconceptions about your abilities, but generally don't sweat that. All right. I think that's all we have time for. If you have any thoughts or comments or want the link to that negotiation video, WTF@badbossbrief.com, WTF@badbossbrief.com. Oh, and I have a new website, Peirolo.com, Peirolo. And it has information about my book launch. I've started doing personal coaching. So if you want an actual coaching session with me, you can do so on that website. And it has some other cool stuff too. So now you know.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. That's all we got. See you in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Adios.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, worst case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief, so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.